Okay, well, welcome everyone to the, whatever our date is, September 21st, 2021 meeting of the Housing and Community Development Committee. We are a newly reconstituted group and it's good to see all of you this evening. So our first order of business, I guess I declare that we have a quorum. And we need to have a motion to suspend the rules because pursuant to Governor Pritzker's executive order suspending in-person requirements for public meetings, we are able to meet remotely via Zoom, but we need a motion to suspend the rules to allow for remote attendance. If someone could make that motion.
So moved.
And a second?
I will second the magic words.
Magic words, okay. And Sarah or someone want to take the,
I will take the roll call. Chair Revelle.
Aye.
Councilmember Burns is not present currently. Councilmember Newsma.
Aye.
Lauren Berlin.
Aye.
Hugo Rodriguez.
Aye.
Kathy Feingold. And we have additional attendees that I need to promote to panelists, which may be able to participate in the vote. Welcome, Councilmember Reed.
So we're suspending the rules at this point, Devon, to be able to meet remotely.
Would you like?
Okay.
Thank you. The motion passes 620, sorry.
Okay. And do we have anyone who is interested in offering public comment?
So we did not have anybody signed up for public comment. However, at this time, we invite anybody from the public to raise their hand using the feature at the bottom of their screen if they'd like to provide public comment. And it does not look like we have anyone that is wanting to provide public comment.
Okay, great. Well, let's move on to the rest of our agenda. And the first thing is for us to do brief introductions so we can all start to get acquainted. And I'll start off saying that I'm Councilmember Eleanor Revelle from the 7th Ward in Evanston. And prior to this, I was on the Housing and Homelessness Commission. And so I raised my hand to move over to this committee once we eliminated the Housing and consolidated the Housing and Homelessness Commission. I've also been a member of the Affordable Housing Plan Steering Committee that worked for a number of months to basically lay the groundwork for an affordable housing plan, which I trust we will pick up again probably in 2022. We'll see. So, Kathy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you. My name is Kathy Feingold. I also was on the Housing and Homelessness Commission. And my background, I currently work for a nonprofit affordable housing lender called Community Investment Corporation. I'm a loan officer there, and I have, my background has been in community development for over 20 years. I have worked for the city of Chicago. I have worked for 4 nonprofit lenders. And I have significant experience in underwriting affordable housing lending and development. Thank you.
Okay. Lauren, would you tell us a bit about yourself?
I think she's frozen.
Okay. Councilmember Newsma, you're next on my screen.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jonathan Newsma, a newly elected city council member for the 4th Ward. I also serve on the Administration and Public Works Committee, as well as the Planning and Development Committee and the Economic Development Committee. So I come to the City Council with a decade of advocacy work with Citizens Greener Evanston, particularly passionate about climate action and environmental justice. I also served a couple of terms in the city's Utilities Commission.
Great. Ugo, you want to tell us about yourself?
Sure. I've been a resident of Evanston for almost 18 years. I serve on the Housing and Community Development Act Committee for a couple of years before this committee got formed this year, and I'm really excited about it. I'm a real estate broker for about 34 years already. I work Evanston in the city of Chicago. I work extensively with a neighborhood stabilization program during the big recession in the city of Chicago, not in Evanston. I also do belong to the Levy Senior Center Foundation Board. And I have been on the board of directors for Association House of Chicago for about 26 years. I am an advocate for fair housing. I'm also a member of the disciplinary committee for the Chicago Association of Realtors and the Illinois Association of Realtors. And I've been a certified mediator for the National Association of Realtors, doing a lot of mediation work within my peers and with the public at large with issues with real estate for the last 20 years. So glad to be a member of this committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Reed, you want to introduce yourself?
Certainly. I am Devon Reed, a council member for the 8th Ward, former city clerk, and I serve on just about every committee that a council member can serve on. And so excited to be a part of this committee.
Great. Okay, Lauren.
Yes, I think I fixed it. Sorry about that.
It's
So my
okay.
name's Lauren Berlin. I'm an Evanston resident, and my relevant background is I spent a couple years working in the secondary mortgage market for a nonprofit community development finance organization, and we were working on mortgage lending to low and moderate income individuals underserved by traditional lenders. And then I was a reporter, reporting on some of these issues primarily for the Huffington Post. And then I put the two things together. So now I'm self-employed as a communications consultant, and all of my clients work on issues of economic opportunity. Some of them it's pretty technical, financial issues around affordable housing. Some of them it's more sort of layperson stuff.
Yeah, great. Well, I think we have a lot of really great expertise on the committee, and I really look forward to working with all of you as as Sarah will tell us soon, we have a big work plan to accomplish. So we'll hear from that in just a few minutes. We have a couple of more business items. One in your packet, there was a copy of our committee administrative rules and procedures, and I gather we need to have a motion to adopt those, approve those, and we can have a discussion if there are any issues with that you'd like to talk about. Yeah, Ugo.
Yes, I found a couple of things that I would like to ask questions about on this, and the first one is on the mission. On section 1, there is an exception to what this committee is supposed to do as part of its mission. It says the purpose of the Housing and Community Development Committee is to act in an advisory capacity to the City Council on matters that relate to the built environment and the use of federal community development block grant funds, except public services category, CDBG, and home investment partnership funds, and the city's affordable housing fund, and any other funding source that City Council deems appropriate to address primarily. So all those exceptions are out of it and are out of our realm of what we oversee. But then it says that the committee is responsible for capital and economic development projects and programs, including but not limited to housing acquisition, development, and preservation and housing services, when we really have been we made the exception to not include most of that work.
Well, I let Sarah answer that question, but I think it's because the other committee has those.
Well, I think it's a punctuation issue, Ugo, because it should say that relate to the built environment, the use of federal community development block grant funds, except public services category, comma, so only the public services category is accepted. And this committee is responsible for home and the affordable housing fund. So I think it's a punctuation error.
Okay.
And we can clarify that by, and maybe we can say community development block grant funds with the exception of the public
Services
category, because that will make it clearer. But then we should also have a comma after CDBG in parentheses.
Okay, that would make more sense than what I see here. And so we're going to be then overseeing a lot of these, or getting reports on a lot of this work that the city will be doing.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yeah, that's
Yes.
right.
Okay.
Right.
I don't know if anybody else has more, but I do have a couple of other
Yeah,
points.
go ahead.
Okay, on section 2, I am concerned with this, the last sentence in the paragraph says these programs and services shall be accessible and responsive to community needs and shall be available to qualify low, moderate, and middle income Evanston residents. Well, I realize that a lot of the work that the city does covers the majority of the residents of Evanston. I think that our work should be more towards making certain or make it a priority that the work that we are overseeing or approving or recommended to council is for low and moderate income Evanston residents. I would like to suggest that we eliminate the middle income, because that will be a totally different category, and it broadens, it opens up to a lot more people that I think that we have enough funds for. To be more specific about saying that we are targeting low and moderate income residents of Evanston. That is just a suggestion on that, more than just a punctuation in this case.
Right.
Sarah, sorry about that.
Okay. So Sarah, do you want to address that? Because I know our inclusionary housing ordinance specifically does include middle income as well as moderate. Go ahead.
Exactly. And it doesn't mean we have to fund them equally by any means. But the Affordable Housing Fund goes to a higher income level than our HUD funding and crosses into that middle income. And in fact, some of our inclusionary units are in that, and even just our wait list management serves those people. But it doesn't mean we're going to be putting our money into building housing for them. And we could certainly do something, recommendations about shall be.
Can I make a suggestion on that, Sarah?
Yeah.
Then it will be that we clarify the language, because then the argument, the way it stands, the argument could be made that middle income is inclusive in our language. And I think that if we make the clarifications up front, then we're eliminating arguments, unnecessary arguments later on. So if we could add that language that you're specifying, that would to me be, and I'm really sorry about my dog barking, but she's a total guard dog, so my apologies. But I will really feel more comfortable that we are going to be able to make recommendations for low and moderate income projects over projects that involve more middle income Evanston residents, because the needs are so big in our community.
Can I ask a point of clarification? What range of area median income does middle income encompass?
Well,
Would
Or
like that
percentage.
same
that can be fuzzy.
clarification.
It can
Yeah.
be from, generally, we use the HUD definition of being from 80 to 120.
Okay.
Technically, the Affordable Housing Fund is restricted to the median. So we don't, and the other thing is when we get into public facilities and things, those are never, with housing, we would always have to have very specific income, restrictions if we're doing housing, because you'd have to do it on household income. But when we look at, for example, CDBG helps, can be used to fund improvements to public facilities for nonprofits that can serve a broader range, but they have to be serving primarily, in other words, 51% or more of the people being served have to be 80% of area median or below. So I think that maybe there's some way we could put something in that covers this. Let me kind of think about it, because it's kind of, housing is different from the other categories. So I'm concerned that maybe if we put something aligned with city goals and the funding restrictions of the source or something like that, because then I think we've covered that. And it would give us very little flexibility for, people can't come to us and say, to your point, Ugo, they can't say, well, I'm a middle income, so you got to make housing for me, because we don't have any fund that says we must provide housing for them.
Yeah.
Does that cover that?
Well, I think, so Sarah, can we make some suggestions for some revisions and then approve them at our next meetings?
Absolutely. I'm just trying to get a sense of, but
Right.
we can maybe give some options.
Okay, right, because
And-
that is a good point, yeah.
And I apologize for interrupting, but I just want to make sure, Councilmember Reed, are you on and can you hear us? Because I've been trying to promote him. He has his hand raised. I just want to make sure that he wasn't trying to participate. It looks like maybe he has lost ability to participate.
Yeah, I don't see him on the screen.
Right.
Oh, there he is.
Here he comes.
No, I just wanted to be a panelist. That's all. Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay. Thank you.
And we
Right.
have Councilmember Burns.
Right, we do, yep.
Oh, welcome.
Good evening.
Hi, Councilmember Burns.
Hello.
So Ugo, was there one more? I think you said you had like 3 different ideas? or-
I actually have a couple of more points, if you don't mind, unless I don't want to be the only one talking about this, but we're supposed to approve the rules, and so if no one else has anything, I do have on section 2 under membership. There is which is Article 3, Section 2B. Ensure that funding is prioritized for projects and services that provide decent housing, a suitable living environment, and economic opportunity for Evanston's low and moderate income residents, which is great. But then if we go to D, evaluate applications, prioritize and recommend funding allocations to City Council for housing, public facility, and infrastructure improvements, and economic development programs and projects that advance the priorities set forth by City Council priorities that improve the health and well-being of Evanston low, moderate, and middle income residents. Again, so, I the same line of thought that what I presented before is what I'm trying to bring up to that. Then if we look into same section 2, so paragraph E, monitor the progress and impact of projects and programs receiving city funding. My question here is to ask, how are we going to be doing that? Because on the previous Housing and Community Development Act Committee, we didn't have the power of overseeing. We were just making recommendations, but now this committee seems to be a lot more powerful than that, and we are going to be monitoring. Just would like to get a little bit of an insight of how is that going to happen, Sarah and Marion.
Well, a lot of the actual information will have to come from staff. And I think that what we need to do is decide what are the key indicators and things that the committee wants to have reports on. And historically, for example, the Housing and Homelessness Commission would get reports on what was happening with the inclusionary housing units and the wait list, and what was happening with the landlord tenant program. With the other, I don't think that we don't really want the committee to be responsible for literally monitoring the staff responsibility of monitoring. So we don't mean you're going to have to go through documents, but I think that, you know, we can talk about things that you would like to have reported on. For example, we have the Anne Rainey apartments are being completed. One of the things that we will want to report on is once rent up is started, how quickly it's rented up, and that sort of stuff. Many of those, well, all those projects are very carefully restricted by, you know, there are units at 60% of area median without project-based support. There are units at 50% of area median with and without project-based support, and at 30%. And so we staff will monitor at that level, and they have to show us documents. So we would report if they are in compliance. But we're not going to make you all do that. That's, Kathy can tell you that's quite onerous. So maybe.
But that brings another concern, because if we look at G and F, that is reflective of a much larger input from our committee. You know, so it is a little contradictory what you're telling us now, but we will be approving is inclusive of overseeing all of those things, Sarah. So I made it as a note on my notes that this section and section 2 of the membership and powers and duties of our committee are pretty large. I mean, this is awesome. As an Evanston resident that is not a member of the council or anything like that, this is amazing. This is an incredible task or orders for our committee. But how are we going to perform? How are we going to be able to oversee all this? And that is my question. You know, I love it. I think it's great. But what is it going to be in place for us to be able to perform?
Well, as I say, certain programs you'll get regular reports on. Other things, I mean, quite honestly, I think monitor the progress and impact of projects and programs is so vague. It could be just deleted. And, you know, one of the things is there are about, I don't know how many versions of these sorts of rules for committees. And so whenever we have to draft them, we sort of grab stuff from different ones and try to make sure we're covering enough, but no one thing is essential. And that is really, really quite vague and doesn't get to, but we do, when you get into F, conduct periodic reviews and assessments of the effectiveness of city ordinances and policies, you know, those are going to be things like the inclusionary housing ordinance. One of our tasks for next year is to look at that and see if there are changes we should make to strengthen it. And staff will work on bringing some of those things to the committee, but this is one of the topics we'll get to is like, should this be a task force? The prior time we updated it, as Councilmember Revelle, Chair Revelle can tell you, we had a combination of council members and experts, developers and financing experts to talk about what would work and what wouldn't work, because one of the things is a lot of those decisions and policies, I think we're going to have to get input from outside experts and bring that to the committee and help form the policies that then the committee can recommend. But you're right, we have a very broad responsibility here, and it's pretty difficult for any one person or any group of, 9 people to bring all the expertise and the time to do that. So some of that has to be task forces and staff obviously bringing you information. So
Right.
I think we have to be careful. It's a good point. Maybe we make this look a little too onerous and we'll never get a committee member on the committee after we, but so I'm open to anything. I don't think there's any harm in just deleting E. I think it's really a vague one. It just says monitor progress and impact of projects and programs. So, but also in some cases it might be, well, how is this project proceeding? Is it on schedule? That sort of thing. It can be quite a variety of different things depending on what's happening at any given time.
No, and I don't think that it's being afraid of the task in front of us. That's not the reason why I'm bringing it up, because I think that it's phenomenal that a committee outside of the council is being put out to oversee and to work on at this level of detail, which I really liked. I mean, there is some mention of the residential landlord tenant ordinance, which it's under a lot of scrutiny from everywhere, from the city of Chicago and the Cook County and all of that. So I'm really glad I'd be happy to tackle on any of these points or help in any way I can with those. But I would like to also know if we're going to be responsible and somebody comes to us and says, well, where is this project? And we don't know because we don't have access to really monitor and check on what really is going on, then we're in a pickle. And I'm trying just to prevent and see how is that going to be prevented, what's in place for us to not just do that. And I realize that templates are used for many committees and stuff like that, but I like to really make sure that if we're responsible, we know how to tackle that.
Right. So would you be more comfortable if we deleted that one? Is it F or E? You're right.
That's almost that E, that subparagraph E. It's not that relevant to me, but the charge is pretty significant, and I like to know what are the tools that we're going to have at our service so that we can use to conduct these periodic reviews and assessments of the effectiveness of the city ordinances and policies that achieve city council goals and recommended amendments to increase their effectiveness and all of that. So it is a pretty large charge what we're taking here. Mm-hmm. And I'm not afraid of that. It's just that to see how are we going to be able to tackle that. One last point that I'd like to bring is I could not see and I really have my vision is deteriorating pretty fast, but the maps are really hard to see. Any way that we can get clearer maps of what we have. If I expand on the map, it becomes so blurry that I can't read, but that will be great. I don't know if that's at all possible.
We can probably send better quality ones that aren't in the packet.
Yeah, I can send you the original version that we usually have to print in 11 by 17 because they're so tiny. I had to scale it down for the packet, but I can send you by email. I can send you all the original ones that are 11 by 17.
That I agree that would be helpful. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Madam Chair, I said my piece, so now
I want to make one point too, and that is in F, we say goals and recommend amendments to increase their effectiveness for consideration by city. This can include, but is not limited to. And so part of what the committee will do is develop its work plan. And I think that's something that we want to get input on. What are the issues that are most relevant and pressing and that the committee wants to take on? And that is one of the ways that the committee controls. It's not like everything in the world of housing, somebody's going to come to you and say, what are you doing? Because that wouldn't be fair to anybody. But that's also, there are some weasel words in some of those that keep you from being responsible.
I just wanted to interject that just from my experience on the Housing and Homelessness Commission. We really look to the staff to be the experts on this, and they're great at sort of whittling down the most relevant information to present to us, whether in the package or verbally at the meetings. Not that you can't take on more research, and I'm sure they'd be very willing to give you as much information as you need if you request it. But I think that we can always turn to them if somebody asks us a question about a project and say, we really think it's the staff that can provide whatever information that someone might request. That's just my 2 cents.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any comments about the our rules and procedures? So Sarah, then if you could give us some, for the next meeting, maybe a couple of options for particularly that one that we talked about earlier, one vision, that'd be great. And we'll look to approve the rules at the next meeting.
Great.
Okay.
I've got section 1 of Article 2, the mission noted, and also section 3, the method of funding on the second page, and then D, E, and F under powers and duties.
Right, great, okay. So since I'm going to go back in the agenda a minute because Councilmember Burns has joined us, and Councilmember Burns, we did a bit of an introduction of ourselves. Could you tell the committee a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, Councilmember 5th Ward, Evanston. I grew up in Evanston, went through the public education school system here, political consultant and an advocate around issues, mainly around economic development, social justice, education, etc. And that is about it. I serve on, I think, most of the committees, so I'm trying to use this time I have as an elected official to learn as much as I can, and yeah, happy to work with everyone here. And I did have one question too for is it Hugo?
Yeah, Hugo.
Hugo.
Yes.
If you can think of any tools that you may need now, I'd love to. I don't know if you have any ideas readily available now, but I'd love to hear what tools and information you would be interested in having at our disposal as committee members. And if you don't know the answers to that now, that's fine. But I would say feel free to bring it up at future committee meetings, or or email me personally, and I'd love to help all of us get that information and those tools. So I think you may be onto something, but I'd love to know what type of tools you think we may need. So as things come up, feel free to share it.
Thank you.
Great, okay. Well, our next item on the agenda is approving our meeting schedule for 2021-2022, and Sarah has indicated several of the meetings where we will be getting public comment on important federal documents that we submit to the federal government. So I don't know if anybody has any suggestions about our agenda or a motion to approve that schedule.
I just have a quick question about that. Are these generally anticipated to be like an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours? I'm happy with any, but just thinking about childcare needs and making sure I'm covered.
Well, as a new member of this committee, Sarah, is 2 hours roughly what we should expect, or?
I would hope we can keep it to 2 hours or under for the most part, because I think
Okay.
it is not reasonable. I would ideally like it to be more like an hour to an hour and a half. And I think that that's, again, one of the things we have to look at sort of from a agenda control. What are our priorities, and make sure that we're focusing on things and not necessarily trying to do
Everything.
millions of things at the same time that don't get us anywhere too. I think that that's really important, because it is a big job. But one of the things that you'll see is some of the things are going to be very periodic. I mean, they just don't take up a ton of time all the time, but they may take quite a bit of time
Right.
at another point.
And to be very clear, I'm fine with 2 hours. I just didn't, I had a start time in the agenda, but no end time. So just, I'm a
Right.
planner. So I just need to be able to
Exactly. Well,
plan.
that's a good question.
So that's all.
No, and I think if mentally we think more in the vein of an hour to an hour and a half, and if we go a bit, that's okay, but yeah. All right, so would somebody make a motion about approving our schedule of meeting dates?
I'll make that motion to approve the schedule of meeting dates for 2021 and 2022 as published in the packet.
Thank you. And a
I
second.
will second it.
Okay, thank you. Then can we just do
And
all? Do we have to do a roll call?
Yes. Chair
We can do
Rebel,
all.
Which we have to do roll call?
yes.
I believe so, yeah.
I say aye.
Councilmember Burns,
Aye.
Councilmember Newsma,
Aye.
Councilmember Reed,
Aye.
Lauren Berlin,
Aye.
Hugo Rodriguez,
Aye.
Kathy Feingold,
Aye.
and the motion passes 6-0. I just want to mention that Monica Bobo has been trying to join, but is having some technical issues. She's
Yeah.
going to try to call in, but I don't know if she will be able to be a participant just by phone, but I'll keep an eye on it.
Okay, great. I hope she can make it. Yeah. Well, now we're ready for the meat of our meeting, which is Sarah's going to give us an overview, I think would be of kind of what we're going to be dealing with for the next 2021, 2022. So Sarah, take it
So
away.
we're gonna start screen sharing. And we're gonna quickly go through till we get to slide 4, I would think is what we need to be on,
And
which is our roles and responsibilities.
can you just confirm that you are seeing the slides in present
Yes,
mode?
thank you.
Yes, yes, we are.
Here we go.
Okay, roles and responsibilities. Well, we have funding recommendation responsibilities for the funds that we discussed, CDBG, with the exception of public services, home, and the Affordable Housing Fund. We really want this committee to have an active role in setting policy, helping set policy, and it will be a lot of material probably brought and prepared and brought by staff, but we have such a range of relevant knowledge of what goes on in our community. I think that we can really get some very strong policy recommendations. And we, especially when we get into certain things like the, it's a few years off, but doing a new consolidated plan, there is a community engagement aspect to that. And the committee also has the responsibility for holding the public meetings at which we solicit input on our major HUD documents. And so that's part of that. So next slide is a sort of attempt to put the consolidated plan process on a timetable. So what we have to do, our fiscal year starts January 1st, and our HUD fiscal year is January 1st to December 31st. We never have our federal grant amounts before the start of our fiscal year. And due to a peculiar regulation in CDBG, we have to post a draft action plan for our upcoming fiscal year. It has to be posted for 30 days of public comment, and then it has to be approved by the committee, or there has to be some acceptance of it by the committee on the draft amount in order for us to be able to put our expenditures back to the start of our fiscal year. For example, this year we got access to our CDBG home and ESG grants, literally the release of funds in late August. So what happens is, without doing this draft action plan, we can't keep our things like the housing rehab program going, our code, some of our other programs that really are paying for staff time. It's a pain in the neck, but we're stuck with it. So what we will be doing is we do a draft action plan with estimated grant amounts that we will have to the committee at its November meeting, which will be the opening of the public comment period. And then we will explain how we got to it, and we'll show you a little more about that later in this discussion. And the December meeting will be a vote to approve it on estimate and hold it until we get our grant amounts, make any adjustments, and then the committee will recommend it to council. We haven't figured out a better way to do this. So it's annoying, busy work, I could argue. On the other hand, it allows us to keep programs going. After the first of the year, we are responsible for developing the Consolidated Annual Performance and Evaluation Report, affectionately known as the CAPER, which is a very, very formulaic, but quite informative report on everything that was done in the past fiscal year. That has to be to HUD by the end of March. We have to have a 15-day public comment period on that. So we get into having that public comment period either at the end of February or in early to mid-March, depending on how our council meetings are aligned, because we need council to approve, we need the committee to approve it at the closing of the public comment period, and then it has to go to city council. So these are just things that are built into our schedule. All of our action plan for the 2020 through 2024 are dictated by the Consolidated Plan that was developed and approved by City Council, and the Housing and Community Development Act Committee before, and then to City Council. And that is our roadmap, if you will, for our use of funds. They can be amended, and they have been in certain situations, but that's our basis for what we're doing. And our action plans, our draft action plans, are all drawn on the goals and objectives of those plans and then ultimately carried out. So that's the sort of HUD framework, and that goes on no matter what. The federal government does not have to have its budget on time. They don't have to have anything on time, but we have to. So next slide. Okay, so as I said, the CON plan sets the priorities and goals for the use of our 3 entitlement grants, CDBG, Home, and ESG, and it informs the development of our annual action plans. The action plan outlines those goals and activities for the upcoming year, and then the CAPER. So the other thing we have is our citizen participation plan, and we will be making a minor amendment to our citizen participation plan because we have changed the committees to which the various elements of the consolidated plan go. Right now, the action plans, the citizens participation plan says it goes to the Housing and Community Development Act Committee, and home funding is approved by the Housing and Homelessness Commission. So it's really just to align the citizen participation plan with our new committee structure. And we will have that to be posted for public comment, and it'll be simultaneous with the 2022 draft action plan. So next slide. So what are our sources of funding and how do they work? Well, CDBG is our biggest entitlement grant. Our 2021 grant was $1,800,000 and some odd change. CDBG has an expenditure period, has quite a long expenditure period, but we have to have all of the CDBG for 2021 expended by September of 2028. And we get these deadlines every year when we get our grant agreements. Home, our 2021 home funding was just over $350,000. Home has an interesting structure where you have roughly a 2-year commitment period where you have to commit your funding and then you have to expend it by a different date. So every single one of our entitlement grants has their own weirdness. The Affordable Housing Fund, that's our most flexible source of funding. Right now, our uncommitted balance is approximately $1.3 million. Our Affordable Housing Fund, most of that money is still from when we got a 2.44 million influx of cash from the link, which did not have any affordable units on site. Our inclusionary housing ordinance has been much better at getting us affordable units on site, so we don't get an influx of cash all the time. There are some ongoing sources of funding, but they are relatively small. We'll talk a little more about that later. Even though these aren't officially under this committee, I think it's important that we at least be aware of them. And there's a possibility that we could get more responsibility for these. CDBG CV is CARES Act funding that was issued through the CDBG entitlement program last April. Actually, it came out in multiple tranches, as they called it. We got a little over, well, almost $1.6 million in 2020, and we have committed and expended portions of that, but not all of it. We are receiving just shy of $1.3 million in home funding through the American Recovery Act plan, ARPA. And we have just gotten guidance on how those regulations are changed from the regular home funding. So those are just things that may come into play for some of the things that we need to look at accomplishing. But as I say, they're not officially under this committee, but because some of the things are so interrelated, I think it's important and relevant that we be aware of it, and that we staff bring you information on those grants as well. And City Council could decide, for example, to say, oh, home ARP should go through this committee. There's no real process for that other than City Council deciding what it wants to do. So next slide. CDBG overview. This is going to be Marion.
I'm going to attempt to cover the CDBG section for you tonight. I apologize in advance for any interruption. Dealing with a little bit of a bronchitis, I may have to pause at some point. So when we're talking CDBG, we're talking Community Development Block Grant. This is federal funding that is meant to develop viable urban communities. And we're talking about providing decent housing, suitable living environment, expanding economic opportunities. And the focus really with this funding is on low and moderate income persons. There's a lot of strings attached with this funding. It's quite complex, as you see in the next few slides, and very specific eligible uses. Some of those include public facilities, infrastructure, rehab, code enforcement, economic development, public services, and then there's a chunk as well allocated for administration because it is a fairly complex program to administer. So here is a general overview of CDBG allocation for 2021. This chart is a little much to take in, bear with us. If you start looking at the two columns in white at the right, this is where we're going to start with. So it gives you, this chart gives you the general allocation for the 6 major categories that we have as far as goals for CDBG. The first white column on the right is the 2021 estimated amounts that we put together when we worked on the 2021 draft action plan. And that's something that we'll be working on in the coming months to do the 2022 action plan. So we thought it was important for you to be able to see that we're not really allocating at a line level, but we're allocating at the goal level with broad percentages, estimated percentages. Now, once we got our final grant amount, on the right, you can see the 2021 final action plan amounts with actual grants number and actual allocation, which is close, but slightly different. The other thing to note as well is the 2 gray columns on the left are showing the 2015-2019 5-year average and the 2020 actual allocation. And those 2 columns were used as a basis to come up with the 2021 estimated amounts. As far as the 6 categories, you can see there's 6 goals around affordable housing, homelessness, livable communities that usually include public infrastructures and facility projects. And then there's public services and economic development. And like I mentioned before, also the line item for administration. As far as the key points around the program, there's really a lot of restrictions. We're going to attempt to just stay really high level in this presentation. Key things to understand is that any project that's using CDBG funds must benefit low moderate income persons. For Evanston, what does that mean? For Chicago metro area, actually, that means $52,000 income for a household of 1, a little bit under $75,000 for a household of 4. We have specific HUD charts per number of household. Those 2 numbers are just examples. The main thing to understand is that there are specific activities allowed under CDBG, and those activities must meet a national objective. There's 3 types of national objective. The key one for us is going to be around low moderate income. So it could be a project that's benefiting a majority low moderate income area. It could be a project that's been benefiting specifically a low moderate income individual, family or household. Or it could be a project that is helping creating or retaining a job that's going to be for a low moderate income person. All those are usually under the low moderate income objective. The other 2 national objectives that exist that are not mentioned on this slide are slum blight and urgent need. The reason we don't mention it on this slide is they're extremely difficult to put in place and very rarely used for our area. So the majority of the activities we're going to want to implement or work with are going to be the ones that are low moderate income that use that national objective as a way to qualify. As far as as far as the allowed activity, there's very, very specific lists. We have approximately about 100 matrix code for very specific definition of what is allowed or not and how, as well as what objective can be used for that activity. So it's also a combination of objective and activity. The gist of it is it needs to benefit low moderate income persons in one way or another. 70% of the funds must meet that low mod objective, and it needs to have it needs to meet the national objective as an activity. Additionally, there's also activities that are just plain excluded or limited. The key ones we wanted to mention tonight is purchasing equipment, construction of new housing, or entertainment is either extremely limited or completely excluded with CDBG funding. So here's the one of the map that was included in your packet. The yellow areas on in this map are showing the census block groups in Evanston that are majority, meaning 51% or more of low moderate income residents. So you can see that would be areas that could potentially qualify as LMA, low moderate income area. Now, there's other factors. It's not an activity must not only just be located in that area, it must benefit the people that are living in that area as well, meaning must serve them. But generally speaking, this is a good example of one of the maps we use to try to understand whether an activity would be eligible. Now, as far as CDBG, in 2021, we have the public facilities and infrastructure, which is one of the line items that was mentioned in the allocation chart a couple slides back. As of now, 2021, applications have been delayed. We need to do pre-application training for compliance. There's about $167 funding for such projects that would be specifically for facility improvements for nonprofit that are serving low moderate income residents. We have different ways to consider as a committee how to handle those applications for 2021, either opening application this year with very challenging timeline, given that we're just starting with our first committee meeting now. Or we could also consider combining the 2021 and 2022 funding and have one application for both. And I believe Sarah is going to take over.
All right, so I'm going to take over with Home. Home is our second largest grant, about $350,000. And Home is very much simpler in terms of what you can do with it than CDBG. By the way, CDBG is acknowledged by the federal government to be the single most complicated grant that the federal government has. It was enacted in 1974, and they mushed a whole bunch of other grant programs together in what they call a block grant. So you get a block of funding and can do a whole bunch of different things, but the goal was to make it more flexible for communities to do what they needed, as opposed to go out and searching for all the specific grants. So that's why it is, well, maybe that's part of the reasons it's complicated, but part of it is just complicated regulations. Home was enacted in 1995, I think, and it is a housing program. The eligible activities are acquisition, construction, rehabilitation of both rental and ownership housing, and rent assistance. There are much, unlike CDBG, where there are a number of things where you serve primarily low and moderate income people or households. With Home, you must serve households with incomes that do not exceed 80% of the area median, that moderate income. There's no flexibility on that. Now you can layer funding into a development that doesn't have all of its units income restricted though, and that's an important thing. For example, you could fund 10 units as home units in a 100-unit building. I'm not saying that would be a common one, but I'll give you an example. During the NSP2 program, we layered Home in with some of our NSP2 funds on rental housing, specifically the rental that is targeted to households at or below 50% of area median. With rental, Home has some other restrictions. When you are doing rental housing, you have to have a certain percentage that is for households below 60% of area median and some below 50% of area median. You rarely start rental housing at 80% of area median. So it's full of additional layers of regulations. Current uses that are agreed on in our consolidated plan are rental units, and it could be, it can be acquisition, it can be new construction, it can be rehab. And examples of new construction are the current Ann Rainey Apartments and the Coach House at 1930 Jackson. We do not have ownership housing as a goal in our consolidated plan right now, because all home has to be restricted under 80% of area median. And it is very difficult in our market to have ownership housing for people at that income level. Doesn't mean it can't be done, but we are not doing it at the moment with home. We also use home for tenant-based rental assistance, which we started doing in about 2013, I think it was. And that was coming out of the mortgage foreclosure crisis. And we had a lot more people who needed to be help getting into rental housing. Our tenant-based rental assistance program is not a huge program. Usually we have about 20 households with TBRA, as it is known, subsidies in any given year. And all of the households are families with children in our Evanston schools. So it's really focused on the well-being of families with children who are unable to afford stable housing in Evanston. Home is handled kind of differently. CDBG, and traditionally, we sort of do big rounds of funding and have allocated funding for our anticipated money and then adjusted to actual. But with home, we do not allocate to individual projects or activities in advance. We wait until we get our money, and then we decide how we're going to allocate it within those activities. One of the reasons for that is home is an important source of funding, especially gap funding, or what is often called soft money in the housing world, which is the stuff that fills the gaps that tax credits don't cover and other sources of funding, and is generally really instrumental in getting projects done in our community. Home also has another peculiarity, and that is known as Choto Reserve. A Choto is a community housing development organization. They have very specific requirements. They have to have a certain board composition. They are affordable housing developers, owners, and managers. We currently have two that we work with in Evanston. One is Community Partners for Affordable Housing. The other is Housing Opportunity Development Corporation. At one point, we had 5. HUD greatly tightened the requirements for Chotos. 15% of our funding is automatically reserved for Chotos, and it has to be a bricks and sticks project. So, for example, the Coach House at 1930 Jackson is using 3 years of our Choto Reserve. And it is a real challenge to figure out how to use Choto Reserve sometimes. There have been any number of communities in the state of Illinois and throughout the country that do not have functional Chotos, and they end up giving it back to HUD. So we have tried to avoid that like the plague. We haven't done it yet, but it does result in some creative projects. And those are generally very small projects. One of the reasons for that is there's another peculiar thing in the home regulations that says, if a Choto ceases to be a Choto during the time of affordability of whatever their project is, then we are a PJ, a participating jurisdiction, have to transfer ownership to a active Choto. Now, you can imagine how well this goes over with other funders when they are hearing that somebody is saying, because of some peculiarity from HUD rules, that, you know, a PJ is saying, no, this isn't a Choto anymore, so we're going to transfer ownership of this project to somebody else, just doesn't sit well with funders. So that is why Choto projects are generally very small. Also, you cannot effectively layer Choto Reserve in with low-income housing tax credits, for example, because the Choto has to be the owning entity of the property, and that is not how tax credits work. Tax credits have a separate owning entity that is the people who are the investors, even though it is managed by the housing developer. So again, it's got a lot of weird stuff. 10% of home can be used for grant administration as well, and it generally requires it. All right, so that's home. Next, Affordable Housing Fund. Technically, our Affordable Housing Fund is restricted to the housing and housing-related needs of households or people at or below our area, the area median. There was a great deal of discussion at one point about whether it should be pushed up to 120% to match that middle income. That was never done. That's something we may want to look at some point. We'll talk about that at some other time, not right now. I mean, it's not something we'd solve and determine. The sources for the Affordable Housing Fund are fees in lieu of on-site units, which have been diminished dramatically, and the demolition tax. Whenever somebody tears down a residential property, they have to pay a demolition tax, which was increased to $15,000 per unit or $10,000 per unit in multifamily. There's a formula there too, and it is indexed to the consumer price index, so it goes up or down with the consumer price index.
Sarah, that's just for, I'm sorry, if I could interrupt just a second. That demolition tax, is that just for residential properties, or would it apply to commercial properties as well? I'm thinking specifically of the Vogue building, which is about to be torn down.
No, it does not apply to commercial buildings.
Okay.
Now, there are situations where somebody doesn't pay it as well. If they are building affordable housing on the site that meets our requirements, then they do not pay the demolition tax, because then all we're doing is moving money around. We're costing them more money. So we don't always get the demolition tax if it is something like the 2211 Maple building, where they tore down a single family house, but they're building a multifamily that will have 2 affordable units. So we're getting more affordability than we had before. So to penalize somebody who's putting in affordable housing by adding a demolition tax on top makes it harder for us to get our affordable units on site, especially with small buildings. So that's one of the things we have to look at in the inclusionary housing ordinance, though. How do all these things work together? Because it almost can be a bonus or a benefit of putting affordable housing on site if you don't end up paying the demolition tax. So that's the trade-offs. Eligible uses are very,
Sarah,
very. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Jump in really quick.
Absolutely.
I'm curious. So just to be clear, so we don't collect demo taxes at all on commercial buildings. Is there a reason why? Is it
on all non-commercial buildings?
Commercial buildings.
Oh, it has never covered the commercial. And that is something we have to talk about. One of the ongoing problems is we are putting all the responsibility for helping fund affordable housing on only residential properties. And that is something that we are proposing be looked at as we update the inclusionary housing ordinance, because we've in the past raised some potential ways of getting fees or money for the Affordable Housing Fund on non-covered development, both residential and commercial and industrial. And I think that there's also a way to look at demolition. That's a little harder to tie in. And usually whenever you have a tax or a fee that is going for a specific purpose, you have to show enough of an impact for that to hold up legally. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. But it's absolutely something we have to look at. So we use Affordable Housing Fund for acquisition, rehab, new construction, whatever of affordable units. We use it for housing services. And actually, this is an example where it is very valuable to us. For our landlord and tenant program is an example, because if you try to income qualify people when they're calling to get help about a rental situation, you end up driving people away instead of helping them. They simply don't want to give you that information sometimes, and it's also pretty onerous to do so. But it's a very, very valuable service. So we gave up trying to fund some of these things through CDBG in the past because the compliance made it impossible. So that's the other thing you get into with funding. Sometimes the compliance makes things impossible or impractical. So we do use the Affordable Housing Fund for our landlord and tenant service, and also for our inclusionary housing waitlist management, which would not necessarily be eligible for our HUD funding anyway. In addition, it says in the fund description that it can be used for homeless shelter and services as well. So it is very, very broad. One of the things that is frequently discussed is, should there be a more formal process for saying how much of it gets spent on what? I think that's something that we need to consider very carefully, especially when we don't have, when it isn't a very robust fund. There have been cases where, you can do something like say, well, 25% should be spent on this and X for this, and you wind up with little bits of money that you can't really be responsive. One of the keys to getting the Evergreen project is we are putting in a combined $2 million into that project, which is about a $23 million project in total. And we literally didn't know how much of our home we would get and when. And we have very complicated mortgage agreements saying we can do, it could be home funding from $310,000 to $500,000, and affordable housing fund the opposite to make it up to that $2 million. That was the only way we could fund it, with the cash on hand we had and with the knowledge of what we would get coming in. So it is complicated. Next slide. Other funding that we just need to be aware of. We already talked a little bit about CDBG CV. One of the things that CDBG CV can be used for as well is homeless shelters. That's something we're going to have to talk about. The city's need coming out of COVID. ARPA is also on the plate, and even though it doesn't necessarily come to this committee, I think the committee will end up working on some things that will combine funding. So I think we need to be very aware of that. And we already mentioned the home ARP, which is from the additional money from the Recovery Act. External sources are frequently layered. We already talked about home and low income housing tax credits, other IDA funding like the Housing Trust Fund. Sometimes we layer our home with either state of Illinois home or county home. We can do collaborative home projects, as they're called. And there are other sources of funding we're looking at for housing needs, especially for rehab. Cook County got a large lead grant from HUD, and we are one of their target areas to be used, for that money to be used, and we may be able to layer that in with our CDBG rehab money and other things. EPA weatherization money. I've been talking with CEDA, who is the organization that implements weatherization for all of Cook County. CEDA is one of the largest nonprofits in the Chicago metropolitan region. But one of the things that I want to see if we can do is get an agreement to try to use some funding layered in with other funding. Again, right now, weatherization its uses are very relevant to the Climate Action Plan, to CARP. But as a standalone program, it can only do a certain amount of rehab. And so what happens is we have lead grants, we have CDBG housing rehab, and potential weatherization funding that the same house and property could be eligible for. But right now, you can't do in a coordinated rehab, which makes them incredibly inefficient, as you can imagine. Plus, so these are the types of challenges we're facing. And I'm hoping that we can get to be a test community and say, look, let's try handling this differently. The weatherization funding comes through DCEO. Michelle Mason Cup, who used to be here at the city, is the legal counsel for DCEO. Maybe we can get some help from other people on how to do that. The state controls how to do that funding. Anyway, just some ideas. Next slide. So current needs and challenges. This is not a complete list. It's not in any particular order. It's a thought provoker, because one of the things that we would like very much to do is for the committee to start thinking about its work plan and what it wants to have as its focus. Overall, affordable housing is huge. We know that. That's a really broad one. Rent and mortgage assistance, there's a great need for it, but there's a lot of it out there already. So I don't think that would necessarily be the best use of our funds right now. Expanded legal assistance might be something. We heard a lot last night at the council meeting from Lawyers Committee for Better Housing about the Cook County Legal Aid Program. One of the things that they do not necessarily guarantee with that program is right to counsel. They give advice, but frequently people are still going into court without a lawyer right at their side at that point. We have other things. Childcare is a big issue, and childcare is generally thought of as a service and would likely be going through the Social Services Committee, but there may be things that we need to look at that are childcare related. One of the things you can do is you can use CDBG rehab to rehab a home that is also a home childcare center, for example. So there are some ways we could maybe help people. And those are also small businesses, which is another goal. So I think there are creative ways we may be able to really look at some needs that we haven't addressed in the past. We mentioned the landlord and tenant ordinance, and Ugo, that is one thing that right now has been combined with some other things that the new planning and development subcommittee will be looking at. So we will not be taking the lead on that right at the moment, but that doesn't mean we won't be pulling you in, since you know about it, to our other work. So that's something that the committee, I don't see as being immediately on this committee's plate, as it might have been before. And actually, as we started out in the Housing and Homelessness Commission, small landlord assistance. This, I think, is a huge challenge, and it's something we have not addressed. We've not been able to address with some of our funding, but I think it is critical. Our small landlords are really hurting. We were not allowed by HUD to use CDBG CV to make grants and loans to them as small businesses, because all of that money has to show impact of COVID. And they said, well, if they're impacted by COVID, if their tenants aren't paying, then they can get rent assistance. Well, there are some tenants who weren't impacted by COVID and just stopped paying rent. And it has been very, very harmful to some of our small landlords. So we need to look at developing a assistance program for rehab, and other things, because in fact, that is our greatest source of affordable, naturally occurring affordable housing, which is what NOAA stands for. And it's something that I really would strongly recommend that the committee take on as something that we need to look at. We know we have to deal with what's going to happen in terms of caring for our homeless residents in the future. We may want to look more at middle income housing. That doesn't mean we're putting money against it. That can also be policy related into our zoning considerations and things like that. And of course, with CDBG, we also have this business need, and how can we help low income people either get good jobs, or how can we help low and moderate income businesses? HUD has a category in CDBG called CDBG micro enterprises. And if the owner of a very small business, which has to have 5 or fewer employees, including the ownership, if the ownership is low and moderate income, then we have this remarkable ability to help them simply as a low and moderate income resident directly, and it changes the requirements from normal that we're normally required to meet when assisting businesses. So CDBG is really complicated when it gets into certain areas, and that's you're going to have to rely on us to keep you out of having to learn the weeds on that. But it is something that gives us quite a bit of flexibility in some cases. Next slide. So that gets us to the work plan discussion idea, which I don't expect we necessarily can try to undertake in detail tonight, although I'm certainly willing to stay on and talk as long as anybody else would like to. But I really was thinking could be an important thing that we could deal with in our October meeting, because I think it really is important to say what we want to put our focus on, and it will help us as staff to be much more efficient. And then starting November, even though you have those public hearings on the draft action plan and stuff like that, that doesn't take up the whole meeting. I think it gives us time to do a meaningful other work item along with those public hearings and things like that. So this is a list of a bunch of stuff. Shelter, as I said, the housing rehab program. How can we help with Partners for Places? And could that be this weatherization and these other trying to pull all these different funds together? The inclusionary housing ordinance review and update, that's in our ordinance that we have to do that in 2022. So I think that that's something we very seriously need to take on. We've talked about a landlord mitigation fund. What is a landlord mitigation fund? A landlord mitigation fund is a fund that is sort of like an insurance thing for landlords who take higher risk tenants. Maybe it does things like it guarantees some months of rent if the tenant is unable to pay, or it can guarantee things like help with court cases if they have to evict, or with repairs if there are repairs from those tenants. These have been proven to be helpful in getting more landlords to be willing to take higher risk tenants. And they don't necessarily, it's almost like an insurance program. You don't necessarily use, but you do have to set money aside so that it is available if it's needed. We also think there's need to look at things that will help tenants, because there are a lot of things that make it challenging, even with the sealing of records for people who have eviction filings but don't go through eviction that was talked about last night. There are a lot of tenants who have credit challenges and things like that. And I think that looking at ways to help tenants develop or repair credit is something we should also consider at some point. Interestingly enough, we've changed our committee structures so often. At one point, we actually had a human rights committee here at the city. It was a commission, sorry. But we do not at this point have a formal place where if somebody wants to goes to our website and says, I think I was discriminated against. How do I find somebody at the city of Evanston to help me? You're not going to get a place to handle that. And I honestly think we should have, and it shouldn't be a committee necessarily. I think it could be a staff position where it just handles those, any requests or any cases that come in. And I think that's an important thing we need to do. And that actually ties into assessment of fair housing and or affirmatively furthering fair housing. We've done a lot of work on an assessment of fair housing along with Cook County. That was put on hold during the prior administration, who was doing away with the need to do anything with fair housing. And we need to see how the Biden administration is going to bring that back and what our responsibilities are. But that is another thing that goes along with our HUD grants. So I think that is almost our last slide. So we've already sort of gone through the schedule and the associated deadlines and looked at key topics. We would hope that people would have the opportunity to review the current 2021 action plan before our next meeting, so that as we get into that whole planning cycle, you kind of know what you're looking at, like, what is this? And also on October 19th, we would like to have nominations in advance for vice chair so that we can vote on that at that meeting. And those are we're still kind of in the getting organized and understanding responsibilities. Obviously, staff will bring back the revisions to the administrative rules and procedures. But Chair Ravel, I should probably let you do more of this part of it. Like, what do you want your committee members to do coming into our next meeting?
Right. Well, why don't we just see if anybody has any questions or comments about all the various programs that Sarah described for us. Any clarification that anybody needs for all that information that, yes, Lauren.
Can you, can someone send us the link to that 2021 plan to review in advance of the
Absolutely.
link? Yeah.
That's
okay.
planned.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Actually, there's a page. It's got all of the HUD documents for more than you would ever want to.
Right. Yes. If you'd send us the link to that whole page, but I took a look at it earlier today. It's daunting. Any other? This is not your only chance to ask follow-up questions about all those different programs, but if you have any questions right now, that'd be good.
I'll just say that I'm drinking from a fire hose at this point. So stand by for a bunch of ignorant questions as we continue our work over the next few months, at least.
Yeah. No, it's a big set of issues and challenges for us to deal with. Yeah.
The last interaction that just took place, will that include who we awarded CDBG funds and home funds to in 2021?
Well, we haven't awarded a lot of our funds, to tell you the truth, because, but we can certainly put together what funds we've awarded. One of the things that's interesting is the largest number of actual awards are done with CDBG social services. And that's the part that's the other committee that you're on, Councilmember Burns. So that's something you'll hear more about in that committee. But one of the things that we really felt is there is certainly a lot of crossover in many ways between social services and the built environment. But in the past, we were allocating funding by funding source, not by need or the type of use. So it really wasn't very strategic and was sometimes counterproductive, because we would have the Housing and Community Development Act Committee looking at one thing, housing related, and Housing and Homelessness Commission looking at a similar thing and not coordinated. So that's why this whole structure was recommended. So it gives this committee a lot of work, a lot of things to oversee. But I do think that it will be a more effective, it will help the city make better use of our funding. That's what I really am hoping for.
So do we have, would it be helpful to look to how we've used some of these funds before, or are we starting with a clean slate saying, hey, we've restructured the committees and we have, you know, a slightly new charge on how we want to think about how we use CDBG funds and home funds? Are we starting from a clean slate, or should we look to how some of the funds have been used in the past?
I think it's important that we show you how it's been used in the past. And part of that is because we do have this 5-year consolidated plan. That doesn't mean we can't amend it and change it. But I think we need to think about it because that was developed with quite a lot of research and outreach in the community. And we can actually, I mean, we did a lot of presentations on that to the Housing and Community Development Act Committee at the time. I don't know that it would be the best use of the committee's time to bring that back to that level, but we can certainly, it has helped inform how we're making decisions. The built environment has a lot of limitations. For example, anything where we are doing this area benefit, where it's a primarily low and moderate income neighborhood, is completely driven by how American Community Survey results come in at the time, because that decides. Your ward has the greatest amount of areas that we can do things like alley paving and sidewalk replacement and things like that, Councilmember Burns. That doesn't mean it's the only ward, but we are kind of restricted in what we can do with some of the funds. So it's not like there's nothing that is a complete clean slate with HUD funds because of the number of regulations. And so, but what I would love to hear is ideas, because what I see staff's responsibility is to see if we hear something that needs to be done, then it's up to us to see if we can figure out if our federal funds can be used for it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. A couple other quick questions. So is MTO funded from home funds?
Is which one? I'm sorry.
I think it's called MTO, the group that we had.
No, that is funded from the Affordable Housing Fund.
Affordable housing, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And what else do we have? And then if you could go, there was one of the slides that broke down like grant estimated amount or something like that. Can we pull that back up? Because I had one question from that, but I need to see it to jog my memory.
Absolutely. Just give me a quick second.
Thank you.
This one?
No, it was up a bit. It was. Is this? Yeah, this is it. This
Okay.
is it. So I'm just trying to get greater clarity on. So okay, I lost out of it. So the 5,222 under 2021 draft action plan. Who establishes that number? Is that us saying what we think we're going to get from the federal government for that we can use for affordable housing, or what are we? How is this number developed?
These numbers are staff estimates what we think our grant will be. And then we look at our plan goals, our consolidated plan goals. And we have agreed in the past with the Housing and Community Development Act Committee that this is why these average how funding was allocated in the prior plan year, and then how prior plan period, and then our 2020 actual allocations were used to develop the draft action plan for 2021. That is based really on a percentage of funding and the relevant emphasis on those goals in the consolidated plan. And so what we did is staff made a recommendation, and this is for the draft plan only, because we have to get that draft plan posted and have the public comment period and then closed before the first of the year. Technically, if we wanted to change dramatically from that, we could. But if it was a very dramatic change, we would have to amend we would have to have another public comment period, because it would, if we change the funding for any goal by more than 20%, or if we add or subtract a goal, we have to do a second public comment period. All of those things can be done. We haven't done them very often because the goal is to try to keep from doing that. There's quite a bit of flexibility within the goals on how you can spend the money within them too. So it doesn't really lock you in that much.
Yeah, I
The
think
other-
just to be clear, the percentage of total is not determined by the funder. That we determine that. We say we want to use 30% of the total on affordable housing, for example, and we just need to establish that, notice the
Right.
public, allow them a period to comment on it. But from
Right.
the federal government standpoint, they just say, all right, you're awarded, I don't know if it's 1.6 million or 1.7, I can't tell. But am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
But in our consolidated plan, because we have priority goals, if we change the funding by too much from those priorities, then we have to amend our consolidated plan. There are some areas that you cannot spend more than a specific amount. Public services can be no more than 15% of the current year grant plus prior year program income. We'll get into that at some other point. So that is a capped category. The other categories are not capped by HUD except for administration, which is capped at 20%. So, but we have the authority to say how much we spend on housing, how much we spend on homeless, how much we spend on livable communities. I don't recommend that we change the names of the goal. That would be an awful lot of work, but we can change the amount of funding. If it's over a certain percent, then we amend our con plan or our action plan.
And then one last comment, I would just say, I think the landlord mitigation fund, I think something to support our smaller landlords makes a ton of sense, especially because I think we heard that yesterday that they're not going to have, there's going to be, how did they say it, Sarah, around the credit checks? The credit checks are going to be sealed, I think is the term they use. And there's a lot of protections, rightfully so, for tenants right now,
Right.
because of what, they just went through. A lot of people lost jobs because of COVID and no fault of their own. Just
right.
But I think to balance it out appropriately, we also need to have protections, in particular for our small to mid-sized landlords. So I just wanted to also comment to say I think it makes a whole lot of sense to look at landlord mitigation funds and anything that can help our landlords who are in situations where the tenant is unable to pay. But as you stated, the hardship isn't necessarily COVID related. So now, and you and I know, I have a few examples of that in my ward. So just wanted to add that as a final comment, but thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so, Sarah, you talked earlier with me about, really needing a small landlord task force perhaps, because there are a number of really important issues that it'd be really good if this committee could address.
And I also think it would be really good to literally involve some of our landlords, because,
right.
They know their business way better than I know their business. And in some cases, there may be things that are helpful that we may not think of, or things that we may think of that will be very helpful, and they're going to be like, not so much. So I think that is important, that they be heard. And one of the challenges we will potentially run into is we may have to fund some of these things with the Affordable Housing Fund, simply because sometimes we get stuck with our federal funds. We try to use the federal funds first, but sometimes we have to use the more flexible local funds.
Right. Yep. So Lauren, you still have your hand up.
Yeah, I have another question.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
And then I actually have to hop off. I apologize.
sure.
I didn't know it would run quite so long tonight. It sounds to me, if I'm understanding correctly, so I have a twofold question. It sounds to me like the consolidated plan for 2021 is essentially a map of how, based on what was understood at the time the plan was crafted, some of the needs and priorities that
Yes.
people, and so it sounds like a lot of our work is going to be within the framework of the consolidated plan that was done before us, and that you all invested a lot of time in getting previous members of previous committees to understand it. So I just wanted to throw this out there, and I know time is short and people are busy, but for my money, I think if we don't want to spend a lot of time revisiting why the plan was made this way and this priority was picked over this priority, it might make sense prior to the October meeting to have an optional meeting where you all just sort of walk through, and we can limit it if people are concerned about length, but the reasoning behind the plan, because I think that
Sure.
it might be hard for us to understand how to move forward. For those of us who were not involved in the work of crafting the plan, it might be hard to move forward without fully understanding the context of the plan. And so if people have the time and interest, I think I would, for one, appreciate sort of, okay, here's what's not in the plan that might help you to understand how we came to this. Here are the constraints we're working
Sure.
against.
Yeah.
Here's what
And
we've
that-
heard from our residents.
And that does make sense because it is this 5-year plan. And as we say, so this is for 2020, 21, 22, 23, 24. And that's the period that this con plan covers. And it doesn't mean it can't be amended, but you're right. There has to be a kind of, this is how we got there and why. And we could do a presentation or a discussion with anyone who wants to be involved in that before the next,
I think it just might help also. Personally, I think if we can prevent reinventing the wheel, I mean, it sounds like there was a lot of thought put into this, and that instead of assuming there might be a need to change it, maybe we start by understanding it and sort of, because I don't know, I just think that would help me.
Another possibility might actually be, and I can look at this, we did a very detailed presentation to the Housing and Community Development Act Committee at that time, but it could probably be simplified. And maybe that could be actually a part of the meeting on the 19th. I just don't know what.
Or if that was recorded and people can watch that.
I don't think it was recorded because nothing was done.
Okay.
Well, maybe it was. It might have been. I'll have to check that. I don't think it was though, because normally the only community, the HCDA meetings that were recorded were the application review meetings and the funding night meetings. So, but I think that's a really good point. Or there might even be some summaries. We'll look into that because you're right. It is a pretty intensive process. And one of the things we did was we actually used the advocates from Cradle to Career to go out and reach out to people and get questionnaires completed from people who normally don't respond when we throw something up on the website or advertise it in our, in our newsletter. So it'd
be good for people to know all the different sources of input that went into the plan.
Exactly. Exactly. Sounds like a robust process. Okay, I apologize. I have to sign off for the evening. It's nice to meet all of you, and thank you.
Good to meet you too, Lauren.
All right, I'll talk to everyone soon. Bye.
So
I tell you what, we will look at that, and Council Member Revelle will talk to you about it, and maybe we can decide what might be a good. If we all get together, we'll have to have another official public meeting.
No, I understand. Right. But it sounds like it might be helpful to get people up to speed, and
absolutely,
it's a big, complicated document. Yeah. So can you email us this presentation so people can go back and review the details of what you.
Oh, this presentation? Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Especially,
and we can actually post it on the website too. We were working on it a little too late to do that in advance. Sorry.
Sure, no, because if next time we're supposed to talk about the work plan, it'd be
Yeah.
good to know all the different subjects that you've, suggested anyway, and come up with some more. So we are getting close to 9 o'clock. Does anybody have any other burning questions or comments before we wrap it up?
I would say my only thing is I'm just quickly touching on the housing discrimination piece. You know, I've opened up a conversation with Council Nicholas Cummins about what the city can enforce in relation to our fair housing, code, and I'm not anywhere closer to understanding that. So I think at a future meeting, maybe we can pull him in and see what type of cases that we can take up as a city to protect our residents who are facing housing discrimination, and which ones we may have to rely on other agencies to take on. So that's it.
Great. Okay. So I guess so Sarah and I will follow up with everybody about the 2021 action plan, and any, perhaps an optional special meeting in between now and then, our next meeting, just to go over that. And Sarah's going to send us some potential revisions of our rules and regulations. And we all will review all of this, the presentation that you gave us this evening, and then come prepared next time to talk about in more detail about the work plan, and get ready for, I guess, our November public hearing. Is that when we?
That's when you'll have the draft action plan. Yeah.
Plan, right. Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. Well, thank you all very much. It's been really great to embark on this big journey together. A lot of terrific information, Sarah. Thank you very much. And yeah, so, and Mary, hope your bronchitis is on its way out.
Me too.
I am not sure, but I'm seeing a hand raised on the attendees thing. Is that one of our attendees who is raising a hand?
No, it's looks like we have a public comment.
That's what I mean. Yeah. Oh.
Yes. So are we okay to do public comment outside of the public comment period? Is that closed already?
A brief public comment, because we are getting close to 9 o'clock.
Okay. Tina, I'm gonna allow you to talk. You should be able to speak.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm out of turn. I just wanted to briefly say something. I was in the emergency room last night, so I wasn't able to make the very important meeting from yesterday, so I'll have to watch. I did want to say, yes, that I hope you will include small landlords, because we have a lot to say. And yes, we were beat up very badly during this last year and a half. And I would be volunteering to be one of those landlords. There's very few of us now that provide affordable housing. And I hope that we can come to some conclusion that would help us. Also, I did have a question. I don't know if Sarah, you can answer. Whatever happened to the project on Chicago Avenue and Howard Street, the $2 million? Was that given to the person? And it doesn't look like anything is being accomplished. It was supposed to be a 26 or 28 unit building with 4 affordable units at Chicago Avenue and Howard Street. And I know that he was supposed to receive $2 million, and whatever happened to that, because I don't see any movement.
Tina, I can give you some information on that. I know it was approved. The PD was approved, but I don't know when it's moving forward. They're not getting money from any of the sources that my group manages. I believe there was some TIF in there, and there was also a land purchase deal that had to do with the city parking lot. So I'm not super knowledgeable about that, but I can try to look into that and see what its status is.
And as the 8th Ward Alderman, I can just very quickly, it's unrelated to our group, but just chime in and say that building is certainly going up, and it'll be, there's a lot of movement going on now. If you've driven by in the last few weeks, you'll see a lot of progress, and they'll be done in June.
Oh, that's great news. Councilmember Reed, I don't drive around town a lot, as probably many of you know, but Chicago Avenue is not one of the best biking routes, so I don't even bike on that one too much.
Yeah.
But I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad you could fill in for my lack of knowledge on that.
We're working on that biking on Chicago Avenue issue, Sarah, but another committee, another time.
Right.
Absolutely.
Okay. And Tina, for sure, we will be in touch with you, as we want to have these further conversations about landlord assistance programs and such.
Okay, thank you, because we're needed a lot. And if you want to keep the naturally affordable housing, we need the help right away. Thank you.
Right. Okay. All righty. Well, on that note, I will ask us, do we need a motion for adjournment, or can I just declare us adjourned? I think I can just declare us adjourned. So thank you all very much. You'll be hearing from Sarah in between now and our next meeting, with the possibility of a sort of optional special meeting and lots of more information. So thank you all very much, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everybody. We're
Good
so
night.
excited
Everyone.
to have such an engaged committee and such an involved group. Wow.
Thanks, everybody.
Exactly.
Good
Thank you.
night.
Okay. Good night.
Be well
Thank you.
soon, Marion.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.